Welcome to the Discourse Analyzer AI Toolkit, where articles come alive. You're listening to the audio version of our article. For the full text and an interactive experience, check out the link in the description below. Interact with any selection using our AI assistant to enhance your understanding. Let's explore.
Bias and reflexivity in discourse analysis. Bias and reflexivity in discourse analysis are crucial concepts that address the influence of the researcher's perspectives, assumptions, and social position on the process of analyzing language and meaning. Given that discourse analysis is interpretive and qualitative, it inherently involves subjectivity, as researchers actively engage with data to uncover how language constructs meaning, power relations, and social identities. As a result, managing bias and practicing reflexivity are essential to ensuring the integrity, transparency, and rigor of the analysis. Bias in discourse analysis. Bias refers to the presence of preconceived notions, assumptions, or preferences that can unconsciously influence the research process, from data collection to interpretation. In discourse analysis, bias can manifest in various ways, such as selective interpretation of data, overemphasis on certain themes, or the imposition of the researcher's values and experiences on the findings. Since discourse analysis focuses on how language reflects and shapes social realities, any bias on the part of the researcher can skew the results, leading to incomplete or distorted interpretations. Types of bias in discourse analysis. Bias in discourse analysis can take several forms, each of which may impact the validity and reliability of the research. Point 1. Confirmation bias. Confirmation bias occurs when researchers unconsciously seek out or prioritize data that supports their preconceived notions or hypotheses, while downplaying or ignoring contradictory evidence. This type of bias can lead to one-sided interpretations of discourse. Example: a researcher analyzing political speeches might focus primarily on examples that confirm their belief that a particular politician is authoritarian, while overlooking instances where the same politician uses more inclusive or democratic language. Point 2. Theoretical bias. In theoretical bias, the researcher's theoretical framework or ideological stance dominates the analysis, shaping the interpretation of the data in ways that may obscure alternative perspectives or explanations. While all discourse analysis is guided by some form of theoretical framework, over-reliance on a particular theory can lead to biased interpretations. Example: a critical discourse analyst focusing on issues of power and domination might emphasize how language maintains social hierarchies but might miss instances where language is used to resist or subvert those hierarchies. Point 3. Selection bias. Selection bias refers to the ways in which the researcher's choice of data skews the analysis. This can happen when researchers select texts or participants that align with their assumptions or fail to represent the full range of perspectives within the discourse. Example: a study on gender in the media that focuses only on advertisements from women's magazines may provide a limited view of how gender is constructed, as it overlooks representations of gender in other types of media. Reflexivity in discourse analysis. Reflexivity is the practice of self-awareness and critical reflection that researchers engage in to recognize and manage their biases throughout the research process. In discourse analysis, reflexivity involves examining how the researcher's positionality, assumptions, and experiences influence the research. Reflexivity is not about eliminating subjectivity but about making it visible and using it to inform a more thoughtful and transparent analysis. Key aspects of reflexivity. Reflexivity requires ongoing reflection at every stage of the research process, from designing the study and selecting data to analyzing findings and presenting results. Several key aspects of reflexivity are particularly relevant to discourse analysis. 1. Acknowledging positionality. Positionality refers to the researcher's social, cultural, and political background, which inevitably shapes their worldview and influences how they engage with the discourse they are studying. Reflexivity involves acknowledging how these factors affect the researcher's interpretations and interactions with the data. Example: A researcher analyzing language in the context of LGBTQ+ rights might reflect on how their own sexual identity shapes their understanding of the discourse and how it might influence their focus on certain themes, such as equality or marginalization. Point 2. Reflecting on theoretical assumptions. Researchers must be aware of the theoretical assumptions that guide their analysis. Reflexivity involves critically examining how these assumptions influence the research process and considering alternative interpretations that may challenge or expand the theoretical framework being used. Example: a feminist discourse analyst might reflect on how their focus on gender power dynamics influences their interpretation of a text, while also considering how class or race might intersect with gender in ways that their initial theoretical framework does not fully account for. Point 3. Transparency in the research process. Being transparent about the research process is a key element of reflexivity. This includes being clear about how data were collected, how decisions were made during coding and analysis, and how the researcher's positionality might have influenced these decisions. Transparency allows other researchers to evaluate the credibility of the findings. Example: a researcher studying discourse in the workplace might document how their own experiences with professional hierarchies influenced their interpretation of power dynamics in workplace conversations, allowing readers to understand the potential biases in the analysis. Managing bias through reflexivity. While bias cannot be entirely eliminated, reflexivity allows researchers to manage it in a way that enhances the credibility and rigor of discourse analysis. By actively reflecting on their biases, researchers can take steps to minimize their impact and ensure that their interpretations are grounded in the data rather than preconceived ideas. Point 1. Systematic data collection and coding. One way to manage bias is through systematic data collection and coding. By using a clear, consistent coding framework, researchers can ensure that their analysis is grounded in the data and not overly influenced by their own assumptions. Coding helps to identify patterns objectively, making it easier to see the discourse as it exists rather than how the researcher expects it to be. Example: in a study of political debate discourse, a researcher might develop a coding scheme that categorizes all instances of argumentation, appeals to emotion, and references to authority, ensuring that every instance is documented and analyzed consistently. Point 2. Triangulation. Triangulation is a strategy that involves using multiple data sources, methods, or theoretical perspectives to cross-check findings and reduce bias. By incorporating different viewpoints, researchers can balance their subjective interpretations with additional evidence and perspectives, leading to a more comprehensive analysis. Example: in a discourse analysis of healthcare policies, a researcher might triangulate by analyzing both governmental reports and media coverage, as well as conducting interviews with healthcare workers. This allows for a more well-rounded view of how discourse is constructed across different contexts. Point 3. Collaboration and peer review. Collaboration with other researchers and engaging in peer review can help to mitigate bias by bringing multiple perspectives to the analysis. Colleagues or peers can challenge the researcher's interpretations, offer alternative viewpoints, and help identify potential biases that the researcher may not have recognized. Example: a team of researchers studying racial discourse in education might share their findings and interpretations with colleagues from different racial backgrounds to ensure that the analysis accurately reflects diverse perspectives on how race is discussed in educational settings. Examples of bias and reflexivity in discourse analysis. Example 1. Reflexivity in analyzing media discourse on immigration. A researcher analyzing media discourse on immigration might reflect on how their personal political beliefs influence their interpretation of the data. If they support more inclusive immigration policies, they may unconsciously focus on articles that portray immigrants positively. To counter this, the researcher could use a systematic coding process to ensure that all articles, positive, negative, or neutral, are analyzed equally. They could also engage with peers who hold different political views to challenge their interpretations and ensure a more balanced analysis. Example 2. Bias in studying gendered language in the workplace. A researcher examining gendered language in workplace interactions may be influenced by their experiences with gender discrimination. This could lead to an overemphasis on instances where men dominate conversations, while underreporting instances where women assert authority. To address this bias, the researcher could collaborate with colleagues of different genders or use a quantitative coding method to systematically track all instances of interruptions, regardless of gender. Example 3. Reflexivity in critical discourse analysis. In a critical discourse analysis, CDA, of political rhetoric, a researcher might focus on how language reinforces power structures. While this focus is central to CDA, the researcher must remain reflexive about their own ideological position and acknowledge that not all instances of discourse serve to reinforce power. Reflexivity would involve critically assessing moments in the discourse where power is challenged or alternative discourses are presented, even if these moments are not the primary focus of the study. Challenges of reflexivity and bias in discourse analysis. Despite its importance, practicing reflexivity in discourse analysis presents several challenges. Point 1. Overemphasis on subjectivity. While reflexivity encourages researchers to acknowledge their biases, there is a risk of overemphasizing subjectivity to the point where the analysis becomes overly personalized. This can make it difficult to draw broader conclusions or maintain a clear focus on the data itself. Point 2. Difficulty in recognizing bias. Bias is often unconscious, making it difficult for researchers to recognize their own biases, even when practicing reflexivity. Engaging in collaboration and peer review can help address this, but it is still a challenge to fully account for biases that are deeply embedded in the researcher's worldview. Point 3. Maintaining balance between reflexivity and objectivity. Discourse analysts must strike a balance between reflexivity, acknowledging their own influence on the research, and objectivity, ensuring that their findings are grounded in the data. Too much reflexivity can make the research overly subjective, while too little can obscure the researcher's role in shaping the analysis. Conclusion. Bias and reflexivity are central concerns in discourse analysis, given the interpretive nature of the method. While bias cannot be entirely eliminated, reflexivity allows researchers to critically reflect on their assumptions, positionality, and influence on the research process. By managing bias through reflexivity, systematic methods, triangulation, collaboration, and peer review, discourse analysts can enhance the credibility, transparency, and rigor of their work. Reflexivity does not aim to remove subjectivity but to make it visible and productive, allowing researchers to engage with the complexities of language and social meaning in a thoughtful and balanced way. Frequently asked questions. What is bias in discourse analysis? Bias in discourse analysis refers to the presence of preconceived notions, assumptions, or preferences that can unconsciously influence the research process. This includes data collection, interpretation, and analysis, potentially leading to selective interpretation or overemphasis on certain themes based on the researcher's values or experiences. Example: a researcher might focus on instances that support their belief that a particular politician is authoritarian, while ignoring examples that contradict this view. What are some common types of bias in discourse analysis? Confirmation bias. Seeking out or prioritizing data that supports the researcher's preconceived notions while ignoring contradictory evidence. Theoretical bias. Over-relying on a specific theoretical framework, which may lead to interpretations that obscure alternative perspectives. Selection bias. Choosing texts or participants that align with the researcher's assumptions, resulting in a limited or skewed analysis. Example: a study on gender in the media that only includes advertisements from women's magazines might miss broader patterns in how gender is constructed across different media outlets. Why is reflexivity important in discourse analysis? Reflexivity is crucial because it involves the researcher's self-awareness and critical reflection on how their perspectives, assumptions, and social positions influence the research. Reflexivity helps make the researcher's subjectivity visible, ensuring that interpretations are transparent and grounded in the data rather than being shaped by unconscious biases. How does reflexivity help manage bias in discourse analysis? Reflexivity helps manage bias by encouraging researchers to acknowledge their positionality and how their background may influence their analysis. Prompting reflection on theoretical assumptions and how they shape the interpretation. Promoting transparency in documenting the research process and how decisions were made during data collection and analysis. Example: A researcher analyzing language around LGBTQ+ rights might reflect on how their own sexual identity influences their focus on themes of equality or marginalization. How does confirmation bias manifest in discourse analysis? Confirmation bias occurs when researchers unconsciously seek out or emphasize data that supports their existing beliefs or hypotheses. This can result in one-sided interpretations of discourse and a failure to consider alternative perspectives or contradictory evidence. Example: a researcher might selectively focus on speeches that portray a political figure negatively, overlooking those that show a more nuanced or positive image. What is the role of positionality in reflexivity? Positionality refers to the researcher's social, cultural, and political background, which shapes their worldview and influences their interpretation of discourse. Reflexivity involves acknowledging how positionality affects the research process, including the focus of the study, the interpretation of data, and the conclusions drawn. Example: a researcher analyzing workplace discourse might reflect on how their personal experiences with professional hierarchies influence their interpretation of power dynamics in workplace conversations. How can discourse analysts practice reflexivity in their research? Acknowledging positionality. Reflecting on how their background, experiences, and social positions may influence their interpretation. Reflecting on theoretical assumptions. Critically examining how their theoretical framework shapes their analysis and considering alternative interpretations. Maintaining transparency. Clearly documenting the research process, including data collection, coding, and analysis decisions, allowing others to evaluate the credibility of the findings. Example: a researcher studying media discourse on mental health might be transparent about how their personal experiences with mental health shape their interpretation of the discourse. How can systematic data collection and coding reduce bias in discourse analysis? Systematic data collection and coding involve using a consistent framework to analyze data objectively, ensuring that the analysis is grounded in the data rather than influenced by the researcher's assumptions. This helps in identifying patterns more objectively and reduces the risk of selective interpretation. Example: a researcher analyzing political debates might use a coding scheme to categorize all instances of argumentation and appeals, ensuring a consistent analysis of each debate. What is the role of triangulation in managing bias? Triangulation involves using multiple data sources, methods, or theoretical perspectives to cross-check findings and reduce bias. By incorporating different viewpoints, triangulation provides a more comprehensive and balanced analysis, helping to mitigate the influence of any single perspective. Example: a discourse analysis of healthcare policies might use governmental reports, media coverage, and interviews with healthcare workers to provide a well-rounded view of how healthcare discourse is constructed. How can collaboration and peer review help address bias in discourse analysis? Collaboration with other researchers and engaging in peer review bring diverse perspectives to the analysis. Colleagues or peers can challenge interpretations, offer alternative viewpoints, and help identify potential biases that the researcher may not have recognized, leading to a more balanced and rigorous analysis. Example: a team studying racial discourse in education might involve members from different racial backgrounds to ensure the analysis reflects diverse perspectives. What are some challenges of reflexivity in discourse analysis? Overemphasis on subjectivity. Excessive focus on reflexivity can lead to an overly personalized analysis, making it difficult to draw broader conclusions. Difficulty in recognizing bias. Bias is often unconscious, making it challenging for researchers to identify their own biases despite practicing reflexivity. Maintaining balance. Researchers need to strike a balance between acknowledging their subjectivity and ensuring their findings are grounded in data. Can bias ever be fully eliminated in discourse analysis? No, bias cannot be entirely eliminated in discourse analysis due to its interpretive nature. However, through reflexivity, transparency, and methodological rigor, researchers can manage and minimize the impact of bias, ensuring that their interpretations are credible and grounded in the data.